Can you understand me? Excellent. Is the recording on? All good? Okay, cool. Okay, so the usual disclaimer. The opinions expressed here are not opinions of my employer, which is a fairly large hardware vendor. So just kind of make sure that that's well understood. I actually will not be pushing any hardware or anything, so just relax. I would like to kind of figure out first who you are and what experience do you have in mitigating DDoS attacks. Has anybody been doing that for a living, or have you been a victim of one? Okay, and so I don't see a lot of hands, so I guess, anyway, in all cases, if you have any questions during the talk, don't hesitate to interrupt me and just ask the question, and I'll adapt the content as much as I can. So how does this talk relate to my previous talk? Well, technically it doesn't. I kind of reused the title. Only about 5% of it will be an overlap with what I already covered in the previous one. Unlike the previous talk, this one is going to be focused only on a particular topic, or a fairly narrow set of problems that are really kind of causing a lot of trouble over the internet over the last 6 months, maybe even a year. The previous talk was very, very wide range, covering a lot of technologies, a lot of attacks. This one will be mostly focused on DNS resolvers, because this is what currently is causing a lot of problems. We really need a lot of visibility, and we kind of have to start working together on resolving some of those issues. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're going to cover today. Just jumping quickly over this one. Now, what has changed over the last couple of years? We have noticed that the bandwidth of the attacks has grown significantly. Also, there's some new factors in the motivation of the attackers, and some of the tool set has actually changed. So, again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of open DNS resolvers, and that's a very, very serious problem. Why? I'll explain in a few minutes. How many of you know what a open DNS resolver is? Okay, is everybody else shy, or you don't know? Okay, cool. What is an open DNS resolver? Okay, cool, that's good then. Because then I have something to tell you that will be new. Okay, so 2010, based on the Arbor Networks report, the biggest attack recorded was about 100 gigabits per second. This was only one of their clients. This was a single client that hit 100 gigabits. At that year, the maximum size was about 40 to 50 gigabits. So that was the threshold at that point. Now, how many of you are familiar with what Arbor does, Arbor Networks? They're a fairly large vendor in DDoS mitigation. They design hardware that is designed to mitigate denial of service attacks. So they have a fairly large network of clients, and their data is fairly representative as to what is happening on the internet. This is why I'm using them as a source. Now, how about this year? Well, let's take a look at this. This is the same graph from a second ago, but it's just scaled down. Can somebody guess what is the maximum bandwidth we saw this year? Who said 300? Okay, 300. 300, it was only about 6 weeks ago. This was the attack against Spamhaus. It hit a lot of providers. Cloudflare was the ones that took the brunt of it. They saw over 300 gigs. Also, a lot of the providers that are peering with Cloudflare saw fairly large portions of it. Well, what does that mean? If you look at Moore's law, you have we're supposed to get the density of transistors per square inch, was it double or something every 18 months, and people kind of approximate from there that computing power and so on and a lot of other things should double every 18 months. Well, this is more than double in those 18 months. We're having like a triple increase in about 24 months. So That's not good. That's not good. Why is that? Well, we'll look at that in a few slides down the road. But yeah, we have over 300 gigabits, and this was only about 6 weeks ago. This was the beginning of the year. I'm kind of curious what we're going to see by the end of the year or next year. So just jump back into motivation really quickly. One of the new things over the last few years is that there's a significant amount of talking about nation states being involved in that business. Before that, we had a lot of kids trying to show off. They don't like each other at high school. They want to take their websites down. Or in Asia, there was a lot of kind of small shops trying to take off another shop's online presence, like even stupid things like furniture shops. Now we have talks about people from specific governments investing heavily into stuff that is actually focusing on denial of service in other countries' banking systems. So it's kind of getting serious there. We're looking at professionals now, and it's not only criminal, it's also people that are fairly well trained and fairly consistent in the way they approach things. Tools. One of the things that is new over the last 2 years is that there's a rise of content management system compromises. So instead of them attacking small boxes, in people's homes that have somewhat limited access to bandwidth, those people are going after content management systems that are hosted in fairly large providers with access to a lot of bandwidth. And those machines are also fairly powerful, so they can send a lot of packets per second. You basically can figure out what that means. We have a large pipe, you have a couple of very fast machines. Well, you don't need to manage 500 boxes at people's homes, which go on and off when people go to bed. You have a server that is guaranteed to be online. There are people actually that are paid to make sure it is online, has a lot of bandwidth. Well, a recipe for disaster. Now, what are open DNS resolvers? So there's two types of them. One of them is recursive, the other ones are non-recursive. Also, they're known as authoritative. I have several slides with pictures, so I'll show you in just a second. Now, just going back to the changes, what did not change? Well, you kind of have to look at a denial of service attack as an event where you get a lot of traffic. What do you do with this traffic? Well, what happens if you have your website featured on CNN? You get a lot of traffic. That's not a denial of service attack, but it feels like one because you don't have enough bandwidth to service it, and also your computing power is not enough to service it. So think of it in this way. If you're under denial of service attack, you just have to be able to service it faster than what they can throw at you. And how much equipment do you want to invest? How much do you want to invest in your defenses? This depends on you. It depends pretty much on how much you want to be able to take, and at what point you're going to say, it's okay for my site to be down just because I did not want to invest 3 million in hardware to be able to mitigate this. That's a business question. But it's kind of good for you to approach it in this way because when management comes and says, hey, I want to be able to withstand the denial of service attack, the first question you have to ask them, what level, how much bandwidth, what type of attack? And of course, they won't be really happy to answer all those questions, but you kind of have to give them an idea of what they're looking at and how much this will cost. Because everything has its cost. You may be able to withstand 300 gigabits, but you really have to have the same amount of equipment as Cloudflare has. And this is where a lot of the preparedness, this is where actually you can kind of benefit from being prepared ahead of time and have establish partnerships with different companies. You can have peers. You can have also contracts with providers like Cloudflare that are going to actually script traffic for you. And it's very important for you to kind of have some planning and know what you're trying to withstand, know how much you want to mitigate in-house, and how much you want to throw at your provider. Kind of looked into this one. Now, another question is, if you want to mitigate attacks in-house, how would you like to approach this? Do you want to be always on, or do you want your SOC to be notified and then they take certain action and you start cleaning up? Or Do you just want to have all of the gear in line, cleaning up the attacks as they come, and then at a certain point something happens and then you redirect traffic either automatically or again through a human operator to your provider. There are good and bad sides in either way. If you have an operator look at what's happening, they can make a better judgment most of the time. If you really need to forward the traffic somewhere else. But to be honest, this is just another element in the chain that can fail. You know, if you page the operator, it will take 3-5 minutes for them to be online. Then they have to, you know, spend time investigating 5-10 minutes. Then they start injecting routes or redirecting DNS another 5 minutes. Well, you're down for 20 minutes already. So think about those things. As I mentioned, it's kind of like business decision. You have to decide what, it's almost like an insurance, right? You can invest certain amount of money or you pay certain premium to your insurance provider and then you get something as a result of this. So if you just have a small investment, you'll be able to withstand you know, smaller attacks. If you invest more, usually you end up being able to mitigate larger attacks. Okay, so it's pretty much, if you look at it like this, you have a pyramid. The number of attackers or attacks are at the bottom, and this kind of gives you kind of quantitative idea how many of them are, and you know that not many of them can create attacks with really high intensity. You know, the guys in the corners, they can only create attacks to a certain level. So if we take this bar, which is your investment, or it is a representative of your investment and what you can actually mitigate, by throwing more resources, you can basically start moving this bar up. So depending on how much you want to invest, you will be managing your risk, what you can mitigate yourself and what you need to either send to a provider that will scrub it for you, or you just be down. So I think that's pretty much the end of the boring part of the talk, so thank you for bearing with me so far. So let's look at the attacks. The particular types here I'm looking at are reflective and asymmetric. So what is a reflective attack? Anybody? Don't look at the slides. Come on, Sam.
Well, the attacker sends a package to a reflector, which then attacks you for them.
Yep, so basically, think of it as using a proxy to deliver the blow. You do not send the packets from your own system, or you may send something that is triggering the proxy, but then the proxy is actually the one delivering the attack traffic to the other party. Now, there's several things that you need in order for this to work. You need to have a protocol that actually will allow you to do that. So, let me see. So basically, if I would like to attack Sam, and if I don't want Sam to be able to see that I'm doing that, I can just send the datagram to you, but I can forge my address and pretend to be Sam, and then when you're responding, you'll be hitting Sam. Now, this is kind of, laborious, because for every datagram I send you, I'll get one to Sam. Now, if I can have you send multiple datagrams in response to my datagram, then I can actually have an amplification effect. So this is about the asymmetry of the attacks. So different protocols allow you to do different things. DNS is one of the protocols that allows for fairly great asymmetry. SNMP as well. SNMP actually can give you much bigger multiplication factors. NTP can also be used, but really no multiplication there. TCP, how would you use TCP to do that, to do reflection? So this is a very good guess. So it's kind of like a SYN attack. You're basically sending a SYN packet to a host or a packet with the SYN flag set on, and you forge the source, and then this host will respond to the victim, thus sending traffic to them. It's not symmetric, but it obscures the original source of the attack. I've seen that a couple of times. The first time I saw it, I was like, really? Why would you even bother? But apparently people like to do that just to kind of...
How would that work?
Yeah, so you're going to send this, so if this is your reflector, this is you and this is the victim, you send a SYN packet with this, to this guy with the source address of your victim, and then they send SYN-ACK to this guy.
Okay. So
This guy
happens up there.
Yeah, so the SYN-ACK is the packet that actually attacks him. And then he's going to respond with ICMP packet back. So this is not going to be very efficient. I honestly think it's stupid, but people do it just to obscure themselves. Because if you're going to try to obscure yourself, well, use some amplification at least. So you can get a bang for the buck there. ICMP, same story. You can just send an ICMP packet, forge the source, it will go back to the victim. Now the good thing about ICMP is that ICMP in general, you cannot respond to ICMP with another ICMP. There are just a few exceptions, and they're not really exceptions. Like for example, you have ICMP echo request and echo response, but those are actually two different types. So ICMP at least will not create the response traffic from the victim to the reflector. Why is that important? Well, because the reflector will see all these backscatter, and they'll figure out, oh, okay, somebody's using me as a reflector. Yeah, and then they start filtering. So there you go. So this is how a SYN flood works. You basically send the SYN packet, SYN-ACK, and then it, with the SYN flood, and this is a segue. With the SYN flood, the idea is that you want to exhaust the SWATs that a host has for incoming connections, and you're actually attacking that host with a reflected TCP attack. You're actually not trying to exhaust the reflector's ability to respond to incoming connections. You're just using them to send packets against somebody. So that's pretty much it. Okay, so amplification, as I already mentioned, for an attack to be amplified, you have to have a protocol that is somewhat asymmetric in the way that they manage things. Let's look at an example with DNS, because this is what has been happening lately. Now, you're all going to see that I have SNMP always in my slides here with DNS. They're exactly the same. SNMP has not been abused as widely. But over the past 3 months here, there has been a lot of activity of people mapping SNMP. It's unclear to me if this is researchers that just want to see how many open SNMP hosts are there that can be used for amplification, or if it's the bad guys mapping the infrastructure so that when we start doing something about DNS, they actually will start using SNMP to do the attack. So that's kind of unclear still, but keep that in mind. SNMP is going to be the next big one. So in a regular DNS resolution process, you have a host asking what is www.cisco.com, and then they ultimately get an IP address, right? It kind of looks like this. Source, to this destination, the destination host response. This happens over UDP, so there's no state there, and it is valid for the protocol. Now, in some extended cases, if this particular server doesn't know the answer, they're going to send some other queries to the root servers, to the authoritative servers of Cisco, and then they're going to get the answer back to the client. Once they have the answer, they're going to cache it for a certain amount of time. That means that for minimum a minute, they're going to remember this answer. So if you send this question many times, they're not going to bother the root servers or the Cisco authoritative servers. That means that Cisco will not even know that there's something phishing going on if somebody is using their name as an attack vector. So what is DNS reflection? Let's look at the same picture, but in this particular case, our attacker, which is 11110, forges the source address to the one of the victim. So when the resolver 3333 responds, the packet is going to hit the victim. So it's all good, right? If we just do the previous query, Cisco.com to something else, actually Cisco.com is slightly longer than the IP address, because the IP address will fit in 4 bytes. Well, technically, actually, all of those will be 64-byte frames, because that's the minimum you can have on the internet segment, but that's another story. The point is that you have pretty much a question and the same size answer. Now, let's look at this. What if I trigger an any query? Any query basically says, give me all the DNS records for this particular string. The previous query you saw here is actually an A record query, and this is any, which includes text and anything else you can think of, including encryption keys for DNSSEC. So let's take a look at the example. That's what it would create as an answer. I actually redacted some of the stuff, but you can see like 9 characters result with like 2,500 characters payload response. There are bigger queries you can create. This was just the example.
Where's the response coming back to? The victim?
In this particular case, we'll go to the victim. So
You did that with a simple dig?
Yes, yes, yes. And this is in my lab, so actually I'm not hearing anybody. This is going from my machine. But the point is that if the attacker sends a query to a resolver, and I'm not specifying if it's recursive or authoritative yet, and the answer is fairly large, they're going to send it to the victim, and the victim is going to see this traffic. Now think about sending this query many times. What happens at the victim? Okay, so this is how the reflection amplification will work. Sends the query, spoofed source IP address 777, goes to the victim. Okay, so now the question is, why would somebody bother running an open resolver? Okay, so there are 2 distinct cases. One of them, this could be your business model. Like OpenDNS and Google DNS are actually an example where you can have resolvers, open resolvers, and everybody can point their machines to them and use them as DNS servers instead of using Comcast servers. Now also the authoritative name servers. The authoritative name servers are the ones that are the ultimate source of information for a particular domain. Those also need to be able to answer to everyone on the internet what the information is. Like, think about the Cisco authoritative name server. Only this server knows everything about the Cisco domain. So it has to be potentially able to answer questions about Cisco to anybody on the internet. So it has to be open by definition. And the third reason actually is the one that I'm kind of trying to shine some light, is that a lot of people haven't read the documentation about DNS. There's a couple of really nice books. Cricket Loo is probably, the Cricket Loo book is probably the one that's kind of like the Bible in this area. The idea is basically people need to be aware what they're doing when they're putting a resolver online, especially when it's accessible from the internet. And just configure it properly. It's not that difficult. It's several stanzas. I'll just show them in a few slides. But really got to be careful with that because it's fairly serious nowadays. Okay. How do you know if you're a reflector? Something we kind of covered a second ago. You're going to be seeing a lot of ICMP unreachable traffic or other kinds of anomalies. Now, if the victim decides to drop the traffic, no route it or some other way, then you're not going to see that. But the point is that if you suddenly see a lot of weird ICMP traffic coming to you saying, port unreachable or host unreachable, well, you most likely are used in a reflective attack, and having in mind the year, this is most likely DNS attack. Before that, like 2 years ago, people were doing a lot of other things, but over the past 2 years, DNS has been the biggest thing. Actually, the particular group that we've been looking at started this activity about 3.5 years ago, and now they're kind of at their prime. But unfortunately, now this idea is fairly widely spread, so it's not only them doing it; it's multiple actors. So, okay, mitigation. So. There are a couple of things to look at here. What to do in order to defend yourself and what to do in order to defend other people. Unlike most of the attacks, the DDoS attacks that we have been looking at in the past, this particular one is slightly different. Why is that? Well, look at this. To defend yourself, you can deploy any cast. And you can use some form of IDS equipment or scripting provider, which usually has a lot of DDoS mitigation gear. And in order to defend the internet from yourself, you can do all those other things. And mind you, all of those things are actually configuration changes, which are fairly simple to implement. So you have this great asymmetry between spending a lot of money to defend yourself or just spending just a little time to protect the others from you being a reflector in attacks. Well, this is not going to immediately help your bottom line just because there are a lot of other people like you that are probably open reflectors, but spreading the word and working with the community on resolving those issues actually will change things. there has been several projects that have been going for many years. Team Camry has been running one for about 7-8 years now. So they have been able to decrease the number of open resolvers significantly. It's just a matter of us having the discussions more openly and
Isn't there the Open
taking action.
Resolvers project?
That's one of them, but they have open resolvers is something else Team Camry has. So there's open resolver project which is different than what Team Camry is doing. Actually, it depends on, you know what, I have to look at which open resolver project you're looking at.
If you
'Cause
type in your IPC if you're Open Resolver, and then it tells you like bind, change your settings, if it's a Windows DNS,
Yeah.
change your settings, so it's not.
yeah, you can do. I'm not sure if this one is run by them or not. Yeah.
Team Conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the point. The point is that we really have to start taking a look at what we put on the internet and what's connected to the internet, and start configuring our own gear versus trying to just mitigate attacks against us. So that's pretty much the point there. Okay, so one of the, did I miss a slide? I think that I may have some problem with my slides. Anyway, so one of the ways to actually mitigate attacks and to configure your gear properly if you need to run an open resolver or authoritative is to configure rate limiting. So if somebody is asking you the same question repeatedly, multiple times a second, there's probably no need for them to be doing that, because the way DNS works is they should have cached that query for the amount of TTL specified in that record, and they should not be asking you this question more than, let's say, twice a minute, twice or 3 times, depending on the behavior of the resolver library. Some of them fire up several requests at the same time. So if you configure rate limiting, you can immediately decrease the amount to which you are a reflector. You'll be reflecting just a few packets in the beginning of the attack, and then you kind of drop everything else. So if you see that a particular host is making 95% of the requests to you, it's kind of clear that you are actually being used as a reflector attacking that particular host. So that's one of the ways you can mitigate on your side. Rate limiting was included in Bind, I believe, as a standard feature about probably a year ago. Before that was a patch, but I'm not quite sure. Maybe it was like 6-7 months ago, but it's standard now. It used to be a patch. Now, in order to fix your resolver configuration, you basically need to create an access list, and that's what the first set of lines does there. Just put your networks. Here we have an example. And then in the options section, you just specify that only those networks can do queries, only those can do recursion. And query cache is somewhat antiquated at this point. It's pretty much equivalent to recursion, but does the same job. Now, another thing, BCP38. So let's go back to the slide. Well, let's think about the attacker that is spoofing the victim's source. So why would this packet even be allowed on the internet? I'm somewhere in, let's say, in Angola, and I'm sending a packet out of my network that is pretending to be coming from the United States. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And the provider through which I'm routing knows that this space doesn't belong to me, so they should not be letting me do that. There are, of course, some complications around transit providers and so on, but let's say I'm a stub area, I'm just a small corporation, I have 50 employees and I have a single internet connection to the internet. Why would my provider allow me to send packets from IP space that does not belong to me? There is really no reason for that. And this is basically what BCP38 says. You should not be letting packets that don't belong to your address space go out. There's several other recommendations there as well. BCP140, it's talking about how to actually configure the recursive so that you do not participate as a reflector in those attacks. Okay, Anycast. This is one of the methods to mitigate attacks against you, or how to scale up if somebody is attacking you. You can deploy Anycast architecture where you technically have multiple physical servers at multiple physical locations that all of them pretend to be the same IP address. So, you know, in regular communication, you have unicast addresses where one host talks to another host. You can also have multicast when you have one host talking to a particular group of hosts. And anycast is kind of like think of it as a larger grouping. You can have many physical hosts that share the same IP address, and every user that tries to talk to this particular IP address will be routed to the closest server. So you can see that each of those users is looking for 555, and they just get different physical server. Now, why is that important? Well, if you have a largely dispersed botnet that is attacking your DNS infrastructure, and if you have DNS servers across all, different continents, if you have, let's say, 4, 5, 10 points of presence, each of those will be locally attacked by the bots in this particular area, instead of all of the bots attacking a particular site. So you're allowing the attack to be dispersed among many locations. And even if they manage to take down this DNS server, at least in the beginning, this is not going to affect the other locations. So you'll still be up. So you're increasing your resilience in this way. Now, depending on how you have positioned the servers, there are a lot of things that can happen if they manage to take one of the farms down. But that is really specific to how you have your network, and how you have your presence, actually. Where you have presence and so on. Okay, IPS and DDoS mitigation gear, that's, as I said, I'm not going to push any kind of hardware, just because I have certain limitations. And also, this thing per se can be another talk on its own. You know, there's several vendors, all of them manufacture fairly good gear, and they have different approaches to managing attacks. For example, one of the things that they do with DNS queries, if they're attacking your DNS server, they would actually send a CNAME as a response with different name, which is actually a hash. And then if this was a real user, they would be able to request again a resolution to that for that CNAME, and then get the real answer. If it is somebody spoofing an IP address, they will never be able to request that again. So it's kind of similar to having challenges. So why is this happening now? Why are we seeing so much, so why is the intensity of those attacks increasing? Well, we're getting more and more home devices that are capable of resolving DNS queries for their users. And many of them come configured in such a way that actually they will act as open DNS resolvers. So think of a small linksys route. Well, actually, when I'm saying linksys, I don't imply that they are vulnerable to this. It's just the first manufacturer that came to my mind. But think of a small linksys router on a Comcast network. You know, you send queries to it. It doesn't need to do anything more than, let's say, 50 queries a second. If you send 50 queries a second to this thing, if it returns, let's say, 2,500 bytes on each query, that's a lot for one single small box. The home user will not even feel that. They will not feel that. Now multiply this by several hundred or several thousand boxes and see what happens. Now some of the manufacturers, mostly coming from China, do not even have the ability to have this turned off. So you just cannot reconfigure the device so it doesn't do it. So you're kind of stuck with that. Also, providers like Comcast and the other home providers don't limit some of this traffic, and they probably should be, because there is no reason for a home user to be resolving queries to anyone on the internet that wants to ask them a question. They're just kind of inappropriate. If somebody wants to be resolving queries, they will probably be running a DNS server in a co-location, and yeah, there's really no logic to do that from home. So another way to deal with the problem is partnerships. It's really, really important to basically deal with, have established connections with the large DDoS mitigation providers, and also companies like Camry, Shadow Server ISC. They deal with a lot of data brokering between different parties that are involved in the process. So just as an example, the OpenDNS resolvers scanning that Camry does, what they would do is they scan the internet and see what resolvers are open, and if you have registered with their database, they will see which servers belong to you, and then they're going to email the administrative contact, and then you know, oh, okay, I gotta fix this one. Somebody on my network just installed an open recursive. And, you know, for a large university, this is somewhat common because, you know, you have a lot of people there learning stuff, you know, installing systems. So it's useful to do that. So that's it on partnership, you know. There's a lot of other people working on the problem. Build connections ahead of time. Usually when you're under DDoS, it's very difficult to build connections because you have problems right now, you're very tense, you want your problem solved now, which usually tends to piss off people on the other end of the phone line, if you even get to talk to somebody on the phone. So work with people ahead of time. Now, compromised CMSs. So this is something that kind of started picking up again probably about a year and a half ago, or maybe a little more than that, but mostly WordPress and Joomla. There's particular groups that are targeting those, and what they would do is they would insert custom PHP scripts or custom Perl scripts that will execute the attacks. Starting to get fairly popular nowadays. A lot of operators do it. So, a fairly big problem. Now, this is actually taken from one of the scripts I have examined in the past. So this is some of the attacks that it was able to execute from a PHP script. Now, why do I have scene bolded? Well, you know how in a scene attack you can basically forge the source address through a random number generator and just, you know, have a lot of packets coming from random numbers going to somebody? Well, if you're using a compromised CMS, the CMS is not running as root, hopefully, actually. But let's say 95% will not be running as root. That would mean that you cannot use raw sockets. That means that you cannot spoof the source IP address. Well, that means that the scene attack will be coming from real IP addresses. So be mindful of that. If you have a scene attack, thank you. If you have a scene attack, do not automatically assume anymore that it is coming from spoofed IP space. Look at the IP space. See if you have repeating packets coming from the same IPs, because you may be able to also enumerate the botnet that is attacking you if it is one of those booter scripts. So that's actually something that you can do nowadays. You can actually pull some signal out of a scene attack. And there are a lot of people that are actually actively tracking botnets. If you get in contact with them and give them list of the IP addresses, they most likely can identify the botnet that is attacking you. Now, something else that I really liked in that script is, you know, the exec and the eval option. So those are not preset attacks like those. This is a code, basically allowing you to inject. Yeah, perfect. This is allowing you to inject your code in base64 encoding, and then it will be executed there. So you can just have any custom code injected and executed from those servers. That means that you just come up with a new idea of an attack, like right now, you script it, you push it out, it's on. Well, this is also a bit of a problem because if you're researching this and if you're trying to do forensics on a host that was taken down because it was part of a botnet, it is fairly difficult to get those. You know, you have to have the logs preemptively, the logging turned on preemptively, so you can have those recorded and so on. So eval is even worse. It, you know, can do more stuff there. So the attackers are getting smarter and smarter. So again, same story with the compromised CMSs. Most of those are compromised not because, you know, the code is bad. Yes, the code is bad, but most of them are compromised because their administrators did not patch them on time. And this is something that, again, people have to be kind of more vigilant. If you are a content provider, if you're a hosting provider, and if you run WordPress, Joomla for your customers, make sure you're on top of patches, because otherwise it's going to get ugly. And this is ultimately going to cost you money because you're going to lose bandwidth from the attacks that are going out of you. Also, customers will go away at some point. So keep that in mind. Okay, questions? Anybody awake? Oh, okay. One person.
You were talking about ingress filtering. What about like layer 7 attacks? Like, let's say you get like a dirt jumper or like a get post flood, like get download flood, and like I've seen it like where it was like a small attack, but it took down a whole infrastructure.
Yes. Yeah. So
Like,
so
you know how,
I,
like, you're talking about like a huge gigabit. This was like a small attack and it just crippled the whole environment.
yes. I can
How would
answer
you
him.
defend against that?
Okay, so there's multiple ways to do that. The most important thing when you have higher level attacks like GET requests is you can use DDoS mitigation gear that is designed to do that, or you can also do it on the cheap end by having a large set of horizontally scalable proxies. So think of an Nginx, and you can have many of those.
Okay, so if I was in like an IAS environment, like you're saying virtual, just set up a shit ton of IAS boxes, because like each IAS box is what, 200 connections?
I would say, okay, let me finish that. I would say the reason I'm using Nginx as an example is because it allows you to do regular expressions on the incoming traffic, and it also allows you to write your own plugins. You can write them in Perl, you can write them in C. So the moment you detect something specific coming in this traffic, you can filter on that particular thing and drop the connections immediately. The reason I'm suggesting a proxy versus a larger scale server like IaaS, it's simpler. It's simpler, it's faster to deploy.
But where would I put that? Like, let's say so I have the firewall, the load balancer, and then my IAS box is off the bit. Where would I put the Nginx? Where would I have that?
The Nginx will be before the IISs. Now, if you, depending on your design, we have to talk specific numbers at this point. You may want to put them right behind the load balancer. And you mentioned firewall. I don't know your environment, but in most cases, in most cases, firewall is not buying you much in web traffic, right? Unless it's a WAF that is actually inspecting the web traffic. In general, it's not buying you much. But if you have a WAF, you don't want it to be at the hot point in the very beginning. Yeah. You want to move it somewhere even behind the proxies, because you want as little bad traffic to hit the WAF as possible, because it is extremely expensive from point of view of processing. So basically, think of it as this way: if this is the attacking side, this is your computing infrastructure. Start basically shedding the attack off from this side and have high performance components that are fairly cheap, like access lists. In the beginning, you can start filtering with access lists, everything that goes to port 80. You don't need a stateful firewall there. From that point, you will be hitting load balancers. Load balancers can also be exhausted. That's another problem. So,
but they're a little bit tougher.
Those are tougher, and also there are certain ways you can run them. If you're not terminating SSL, you can have a direct server response, which is going to only do hashing on the incoming packets, and then based on the hash, it will send it to different backend, versus doing a complete TCP session management and then opening another session management, because some of them run in proxy mode.
That's like after load balancer is our VIP. So the VIP is basically all our virtual IPs. That's what everything is hitting to. So
you can still do DSR with that. I'll show you how to do DSR. I just don't want to hijack this. And I'll talk with you in just a second. The point actually today was mostly around open DNS resolvers, because it is a problem. It is a very serious problem, and we need to start addressing it. And the only way I can kind of see this is by more people being aware of the problem and going and reconfiguring their servers. So I think that's it. Other questions? Thank you, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, if your organization is under attack, in the midst of a DDoS attack, how would you respond to that? What would be the steps you take to stop the attack and bring the organization back online?
Okay, the question is, if your attack is if your organization is in the midst of a DDoS attack, what do you do now? So at this point, it's a bit late to think about stuff. You have to have a plan before you actually get attacked. But back to your question, work with your provider. Your network provider most likely already have established partnerships with different corporations that actually do that, do DDoS mitigation. One of the easiest things is to route your traffic through one of the scripting providers like Prolexic, Cloudflare, Akamai. This is probably the fastest thing to set up. I wouldn't say it's the cheapest, but it depends how much it would cost you for your site to be down. So that's probably the easiest thing to do. Okay, questions? Cool, thank you guys. Oh, and I forgot, just an ad here. If you're interested, I'm running a small con called Baythread in Northern California. Yeah, Christian, thanks. And yeah, so it will be happening in the beginning of December. Actually, Sam speaking usually at this one. So cool. Thank you, guys.